Good evening, and thank you for joining the New York Jewish Week and UJA-Federation of New York for our monthly Folio literary series. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, the parent company of the New York Jewish Week. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome author Sam Sussman in conversation with award-winning author Menachem Kaiser for a very personal look at this extraordinary story of love, origins, and self-discovery. Based on Sam's life story, The Boy from the North Country is a sweet, tender mother-son love story, a rare view into the creative life of Bob Dylan, and a tribute to the power of Jewish literary tradition. Our partner, UJA of New York, also values in Jewish traditions. The recent New York Jewish Community Study showed that Jews across generations are looking for more ways to live Jewish, to celebrate Jewish, to belong Jewish, to connect Jewish. UJA is seizing the moment to invest even more in forward-thinking, vibrant Jewish life in young families to ensure there are safe spaces to explore, celebrate, make memories together at home, in day school, in synagogues, or their local community center. You can learn more about UJA and all the work they do on their website. The link is in the chat. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Menachem Kaiser and Sam Sussman and start our program.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Much thanks to Thea and Beryl and everyone else who's made this evening possible. Really delighted to be here in conversation with Sam. And so just a little bit of housekeeping. So we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. And for the first time, but not the last time, I'm going to encourage everyone to actually purchase the book. There should be a link in the chat. It should come up soon. Please do. And so, this is it's a double privilege to be hosting this tonight because I'm an admirer of Sam's work. And I'm also, it's also, I feel very honored to call Sam a friend. And encountering a book like this, written by a person like this, it's very special to be able to have a conversation with Sam. And so I'm just going to do a quick check-in because I don't know if all of you guys know that the book only came out. When did it come out, Sam?
Tuesday.
Tuesday. So how are you feeling right now?
Extraordinary. I'm very grateful to you for being in conversation, to Thea and 70 Faces Media and UJA for putting this together, New York Jewish Week for putting this together, and for everyone who came out today. And I think, as a writer, you spend so much time thinking about the book that you're writing, and you spend a few years, alone at the writing desk, and then you finish and you go out and you share it with the world. And that's an enormous privilege. And I'm just happy to be here.
So the book is such a rich text for so many reasons, but it's also, because it's you and it's your life and it's your novel and it's your art, and you're sort of mixing this together in sort of, as I've never really seen it done like this before. And so I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time discussing the content, the specific content of the book, because all 109 people who are here right now are going to purchase it. But what I would like to do is sort of take a step back and like maybe approach the genesis of it. And so, I was also just thinking through the context of our friendship. And so you first reached out to me, remind me if I was wrong, it was right after your essay that appeared in Harper's, right?
That's right. That's right.
So can you tell me a little bit about the essay?
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, before we get into that and my writing, I just have to say, for those of you who don't know Menachem, I mean, he is an extraordinary writer, an extraordinary person, and I'm really lucky to call him a friend. And to me, one of the great pleasures of being a writer is when you come across a book that you love. And, many times in life, I've read something that struck me as so powerful and potent, and I wanted to know the person who wrote this book. And sometimes you reach out, and in very, very rare circumstances, the writer is as extraordinary as the writing. And that is unequivocally true in Menachem's case. And just, thank you for doing this. And let's go back and talk about it. So it's interesting writing a novel from your life. I think, I first wrote an essay in Harper's Magazine a few years ago called The Silent Type on possibly being Bob Dylan's son. And that was me telling the material that's in this novel, but as a memoir. And that was important to me to write that as a short nonfiction piece, to tell the story, to get it out there. But then when I went to expand the work, what was essential to me is that the book I wrote would be a work of art that was larger than the experience of my life. We all go through life and we accumulate experience. And as an artist, I think the deepest ambition is to create something that is larger than you, larger than merely that experience, that's layered with meaning and motif and metaphor and reference and emotion and memory. And this is so deeply a work of art that is about the creation of works of art. It follows my mother, a character based on my mother, when she's a young woman in Bohemian Jewish 1970s New York, and she's trying to understand what it means to become herself as an actress, as she's playing Hedda Gabler. And the Dylan that we meet in this book, the Dylan my mother met beginning in 1974, is going through deep personal and artistic crisis. And he's trying to understand how to take all of that anguish and put it into the album that becomes Blood on the Tracks. And the character who's based on me as my middle name, Evan, is trying to understand how to take all of the complexity of his life and identity and turn it into a novel. And that's the journey of Boy from the North Country. And I thought that would be much clearer as a novel than as a memoir. And that's it's a little bit about, there's more to say about the Genesis, but it's a little
But
bit about how I thought about it.
let's take a step back for a second. You grow up in upstate New York, right?
Goshen, biblical Goshen.
Biblical Goshen, and you have do you remember your first encounter of Bob Dylan as a not as potentially your dad, but as a person, as an artist, as a person in the world?
Yeah, I mean, a teacher of mine said, well, hey, you really look like this musician. You should listen to him. And, I was kind of that kid who was in the last row of class, like scribbling poetry in a marble composition notebook. that was me at 13. And this teacher said to me, you know, some people say he's a poet. Listen to his music, you might like it. And I did. And you know, Love Minus Zero was the first song I listened to, and I thought it was extraordinary.
Okay, so you're a teenager,
Yeah, at 13 at that point.
you're 13, you encounter Bob Dylan as an artist, and some sort of like mentions from strangers that you might bear a resemblance to him. How are you metabolizing that at that point? Like he becomes your
Well,
hero? Like he's your hero.
no, that's too much. That's too far.
Yeah.
That's a couple journalists have dramatized it by writing it that way. That's their story. I see why it appeals to them. But no, I mean, he was an artist I admired. And you know, I had a lot I thought that resonated with me in his story. You know, he was also, I was this Jewish kid in a rural part of America, yearning to leave that behind and find a larger city and you know, a larger culture that I could be a part of, and you know, go back to the New York that my mother had lived in, you know, before she moved upstate and had me. And you know, he I knew was from a rural part of the Midwest, and you know, he seemed to me someone who, when he wasn't that much older than me, had sort of, you know, written himself into New York City, arrived, you know, become this artistic figure. And I mean, that's everyone's dream when you're a kid, right? And you kind of imagine, you know, what would it be like if I could, you know, write poetry that would make me feel better than just like a schmucky 13-year-old, which, you know, was my experience like so many other people.
I just want to mention, you know, to you and to the audience that like for me personally, having this conversation with you right now is kind of exceptionally confounding in the best possible way because I don't know these personal details from you. I know them from your book. And so the book is sort of operating on these twin levels of art and biography. And I get the sense that you very intentionally fuzzed that line in a way that I'm very, I, I find it like very appealing and very interesting and a very, very rich text that stands alone and also stands as a text of Sam Sussman.
That's interesting. See, I don't think I did the fuzzing. I think life did the fuzzing. I think I think we live in this culture where there's a notion that we all have. David Grossman has this notion he talks about sometimes. He says a legislative story. We each have a legislative, he means an official story of our lives, right? But I think life is so much more complex than that. Life is so much how we choose to understand who we are, right? And there are a lot of ways that I could have written this story. There are a lot of ways that I could understand who I am, right? And Boy from the North Country is a journey toward understanding what are the things and who are the people that have actually made me who I am, right? And it's and it's also in some ways the writing of that book helped me understand who am I, right? It is a way of sort of offering an account to myself of what made me the person that I am. And I think there is, yeah, I'll just say that. But I think that's what art should do. I think that's what literature should do. It should be the way that we understand who we are. Someone said to me recently, this is an old-fashioned novel. It's a novel in which you are becoming a self through your encounter with other works of art, music, theater, other literature. And I think that's right. I think that's what art is for.
Uh, This is super interesting. I want to go back to the biography for a second because I'm finding it really interesting to sort of fill this in. And so at what point are you starting to reckon as an artist as yourself with your patrimony?
Well, um, at a certain point, so first people are telling me, you know, you look like Dylan, which was flattering and nice. Who doesn't want to be told they look like a famous musician? And then at a certain point, someone says to me, you know, your mother knew him. And this was the moment, what? You know, because we had this very quiet life, an unassuming life in the woods. in the Hudson Valley. I mean, we didn't know anyone who was famous, culturally connected, had celebrity or money, or I mean, anything like that. That just wasn't, my mother had an intentionally cultivated, quiet life. Um, and also the idea that she could know him. I mean, I only knew him through his music, right? So to me, it was like saying, she knows Shakespeare. Like, well, what are you talking about? Um, and then, I started talking to her about that. And at first, she didn't want to talk about it. And then she said, oh, I knew him a long time before you came along. And then eventually she said, okay, well, I might have been seeing him again not so long before you were born. And that's the moment at that point where I have to think about everything in very different terms.
So how old were you when that
I was
happened?
15.
So when 15, when you're starting to sort of reckon with the possibility, with this distinct
Yeah,
possibility
yeah,
of being Dylan's child.
yeah.
And was your mom part of that reckoning as rather than just a catalyst?
Um, what do you mean part? I mean,
As in, like,
yeah,
it's a big thing to drop, and especially on a 15-year-old. And was this something you talked about with your mother, in like immediately after that?
the piece that I wrote for Harper's, it's called The Silent Type. And it's also a reference to in Tangled Up in Blue. Um, it's the woman says to him, you look like the silent type. Were you going to say hello? You look like the silent type. So we didn't have that many conversations about it.
And so did you start identifying as a writer when you were a teenager? Did you
I think
sort of have
probably
aspirations?
Probably earlier than that. Yeah. I mean, I remember being like 7 or 8 years old and going to play in a basketball game and then coming home and writing down everything that happened in the basketball game and realizing like I like basketball, but I love writing. And that had always, but also my mother really cultivated that. My earliest memories are her reading to me, and where she raised me, it was this, I mean, quiet, beautiful landscape in the woods, and we didn't have TV. She somehow kept the internet away from me until I was about 12, and so it was really a world of creativity and literature, and so that it wasn't a moment of like, oh, I'm a writer. It was more just I grew up surrounded by stories, and those were the things I loved, and then I was writing myself, and yeah, that was just always part of who I was.
You have some passages about this in the book, what I'm about to say, as in like the confronting the possibility of Dylan's son being both sort of a gift and a curse as you're trying to find your own artistic voice.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, right? I mean, I think it's one of these things that it looks so large from the outside, but then you get close to it, and I think I tried to write about this. It looks or feels different than I think what people might imagine, right? That no artist wants to be defined by another artist, no matter who that person is. And I think that's also one of the reasons that Boy from the North Country is a novel. That this is I had a difficult task on my hand. I had to write about Dylan, and I wanted to write about my mother's account of their relationship, and she was with him as I said earlier at this sort of pivotal moment where he's writing his most iconic albums, and I didn't think that what she told me just belonged to me. I wanted to share that, but I also knew that I had to write a book in which Dylan featured, but that then was larger than him. It couldn't be derivative of Dylan. That wouldn't be interesting to anyone. I don't want to. I don't want anyone to look at me and see someone else. All
So,
right. And
but I will say as sort of like it's kind of a demographic. Um, I feel like I'm letting down my demographic that I actually don't know that much about Dylan. Despite being a 40-year-old Jewish male. I don't know that much. I'm much more interested in Sam Sussman personally than
Thank
I
you.
am in
Great.
Bob
Thank you.
Dylan.
Fantastic. Okay,
And
great.
so, like when you're in your, let's say, 20s, and so you're like, you have aspirations to be a writer. You're taking yourself seriously as a writer. Did you at that point have any sort of ambition to integrate the sort of the maybe Dylanness of your identity into a work of fiction?
No, none. No. I spent my whole 20s writing about other things. I didn't want to touch this. I didn't want to go near it.
And
Absolutely not.
do you think now, looking back, that was like a an avoidance?
No, I think well, sure, it was an avoidance, but it was also, it was the right decision because I couldn't have written about this with the sensitivity or nuance that I needed until I'd been a bit older and a bit more mature and gone through certain things. And I think really, we're talking about the Dylan element, but the other sort of core part of this book is the experience of losing a parent, right? And and that that experience completely transformed me. I was with my mother in the last months of her life, and for anyone who's ever been with a loved one in those last months, it fundamentally changes how you think about your life and what's important. And for me, I think that my mother's death let me contextualize the Dylan in a way that nothing else would have. Because after her death, you go through something like that and you're forced to just ask, okay, who am I? This person who raised me and loved me and made me is gone. So how am I going to live in this world? Who am I going to be? Right? And toward the end of the book, there's a moment where I'm writing about I'm in the hospital with her and realizing we don't have a lot of time. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to keep living and realizing I have to draw on everything that she gave me, her love, her life. And, Dylan doesn't know me, doesn't love me. That's not, you can't live by that. That's not real, right? So I think I'm glad I never tried to write about this earlier. I don't think it would, I didn't have the life experiences to make sense of it. And yeah, I think that the part with him and the part with her, the end of her life, they fit together into the same story, and then that's when I was able to start writing.
You have like a really admirable, I found it sort of on a literary level, really interesting embrace of the ambiguity or like the unresolvedness throughout of your own patrimony, of what your mother did tell you and did not tell you, and sort of being saying, hey, this is not just like sort of a lack of information, this is a kind of freedom.
Mm. Hmm.
And so
Yeah,
is this I like
yeah.
I am just so fascinated in like when what the impetus to write the text versus the actual text writing itself and like what sort of insights were earned during that. And then I don't know, catharsis is the right word, but sort of like after the text is finished and then published, which are two very different events,
Yeah.
how you sort of embrace these sort of like these I don't like what would you even call them now? Became gaps in your identity. Then they were sort of then it's sort of an unresolvedness. And then I see them as sort of bridges between you and your mom.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing is that the writing this book and going through everything with him brought me closer to her, right? I mean, that's the magic of the experience, and that's the story. That's how I choose to experience the story and choose to write about it. I mean, all of my questions about their relationship and that time of her life, what it did was bring us into conversation about who she was when they met, when she was in her 20s, when she was having this life as an artist, as a different woman than the woman I knew in her 30s and 40s, and when she was raising me, and then after that, right? And so, you know, I I think we live in a culture in which, and in some ways, we live in a very literal culture in which people think that sort of the facts set us free, right? But actually, what sets us free, the great freedom that we all have as people, is to make sense of our own lives, to render our own interpretations of who we are. right? And that's different than understanding the facts or truth. It's different than understanding the facts of our life. It's about how we make sense of what matters to us, right? And that's really what this novel's about. It's my journey, my character's journey toward understanding what matters, right? And there are early moments. You asked before about whether my mom was involved. To what extent we talked about things when I was younger, and what would happen is I would ask her something direct, and she would give an indirect answer. So I would say, like, what's the truth here? And she would say, Sam, what matters in life is who is there for you. When you struggle, when you thrive, who is there to love you as you deserve to be loved, as you need to be loved? That's what matters in life, right? Um, and that's an emotional and a spiritual and a moral truth. That's not a fact, right? But that's how we understand who we are, by answering that question.
I mean, I'm just very fascinated by the whole topic, and I find you to be sort of an unusually, um, you just you speak so interestingly and eloquently about these issues, and so I just want to
Thank
push
you.
even a little more. So it sounds like
Sure.
I'm interested in sort of how you thought about. I know you've sort of answered this writ large, but just to hone in a little bit about the facts of your life, which includes your mother's life, and in a very strange way, the facts of Bob Dylan's life, but all that is sort of operating through the medium of your mom.
Yeah.
Like you're
Yeah.
not like getting archival material. This is not like a Bob Dylan research project. This is
No.
sort of mining your mom's history for
Yeah.
this unexamined part of her life, which Bob Dylan plays a guest role, like not the other way
Yeah.
around. And
Yeah.
so as a sort of like a chronicler of your life, like I'm interested in sort of your philosophical positioning towards your life events and your mom's life events.
Yeah. Well, that's also, truth is so much deeper than facts, right? And so part of the truth of a story is, who do we put at the center of it, right? I put my mother at the center of the story, and then we see Dylan through her eyes, right? And that's because my ambition is to conjure her and pay tribute to her life. And then Dylan passes through it. And I mean, there are unique things about Dylan that she saw. I mean, in this apartment where I am right now, she lived here when they were beginning this relationship, and he would come here and write here. So we get the vantage point of this apartment onto Dylan. But that's what she knew. That's what she had. I don't. Someone else can go write the definitive biography of his life, right? I mean, but I think that's also something about um you know, people always want to own an artist, and that's not how it works. So I have no ambition to know everything that's possible about him. But what I do care about is writing a book in which I put all my memories and my about my mother and the way that she lived, her wisdom. That's not about collecting the facts of her life. That's about collecting the truths of her life, right? The things by which she chose to live, right? And that's what the book is. And I think actually that's, to me, what makes it so deeply Jewish literature, because what we do in Judaism is that we tell stories that convey the wisdom that one generation is trying to give to another generation, right? And this book is collecting the wisdom that my mother tried to give to me, that I didn't always understand when she was alive. I understood it partially, and I still understand it partially, but a little more, right? And I think that's what literature's for. I don't know what else it's for.
Did you ever consider, you gave yourself one of sort of the wildest assignments I've ever seen a writer, let alone like a writer of a first novel, give themselves. Right. It's a big assignment. I know the word audacity is getting thrown around in some of your other interviews, but I'm really into it because I do think you've approached this with like extraordinary chutzpah, in a way that I love. And so I'm curious, when you sort of approach this, did you consider, or did it ever occur, or maybe it did happen and you decided to sort of backpedal of doing a significant departure from the history? As in, did you ever do like I don't know, maybe in your book you get to meet Bob Dylan, or maybe your mother didn't die, or maybe, you're a complete, maybe you changed identities in a way that were more profound, or something that veered away from the facts of your life. And I know the facts don't define like the literary truth of the novel, but they do certainly sort of shape it. And so, yeah, was that ever sort of a thing?
No, I never thought about that, but that's because I needed something very particular from writing this novel. I needed to come to terms with the experiences that had made me who I was. And so the sort of radical departure that you're talking about, that wouldn't have served what I was trying to do in a sort of emotional, artistic sense. And so, I mean, what I did have to do, which was difficult, was actually cut away the parts of my life that I cared about, right? So there are all sorts of experiences. The first version of this novel was something like 165,000 words, and it's published at 92,000 words, which is actually makes it a readable book. Um,
I'll just add there that 92,000 is already on the thicker side of most commercial books for those.
don't scare people away. It's 300 pages, but
No, no. What are you saying? It's
it's
meatier. You have like more meal
yeah,
there. Everyone, get
okay,
in.
okay, yeah. But that's what makes it hard to write from your own life, that you have to cut away things that are true, and you think, but then you ask yourself, well, why is that there? Is it there because it happened to me? Or is it there because it has a deeper meaning, right? And I actually want to say, I mean, you were asking me about the sort of, philosophy of how what I put into the book. I think people are really fixated on truth or fiction, but there's something else here, which is the meanings that we read into our life. That's between truth and fiction. So I was with my mother in the hospital the last 7 days of her life. All right. That's truth. But what makes it literature, what makes it fiction when I write it is that I decide, well, this is 7 days. I have to give this a biblical dimension. These were the 7 days that made and remade me, because there were the 7 days I walked into that hospital thinking my mother had years to live, and I walked out when she was dead. All right. So, how do I understand that? Well, I'm drawing on all of the deep spiritual and artistic resources of Judaism. And one of those is the most profound story. How was anything made? How was our world made in 6 days and God rested on the seventh day? Right. So I weave into that telling all sorts of biblical motifs. Right. And the day on the third day, there's sunlight. Right? Is that right? Or am I messing the day? Well, in the book, on the third day, we move to a room that has a clearer view of the sun. And we did that. We did that. But I don't remember if it was the third day, and I didn't look it up because it doesn't matter. Because it's about the way that we make sense or assign meaning, right? On the day, is it the fifth day that nature is created? Well, there's a moment on the fifth day where my character sees a fern in the hallway, and he steals the fern and he puts it next to his mother's bedside because my mother loved nature. And I wanted her to smell the fern when she was losing her senses. I wanted her to leave this world with her love of nature, right? That happened. But also my choice to put it on the same day, which in the Torah, God created nature. That's me assigning meaning. That's me making art and literature out of the experiences of my life.
It's kind of interesting. I think this is correct me if I'm wrong, but this is your first major Jewish event.
Well, Monday night was pretty Jewish. I was in conversation with Tony
Jewy,
Kushner,
that's
but
Jewy. No, no, Jewish
oh, it's
institution.
not Jewish. It's
Yeah.
oh, okay.
So there's like and I haven't heard you to talk about it, nor have I really seen it in like the interviews yet. There's a real strong Jewish presence. Not quite, it's not subtext. It's sort of like something liminal. It's like it sort of haunts the pages. Hasidim pop up here, all the time. There's a chassid, a pedestrian chassid, and that guy shows up in the hospital. You have like Jewish lineage of writers that you're clearly tapping into very intentionally. You're doing callbacks to sort of historical photos you've seen from the concentration camps, even. And so I'm interested first because I don't know, like before you began sort of tackled this project, I just give me like a couple bits of like how you identified Jewishly.
Oh, you know what? That's such a hard question because I don't fit into any of the boxes.
I didn't think you
I,
did. If I thought you did, I would have sort of imposed it. Yeah.
it's so interesting. You know, my mother had a deep spiritual relationship with Judaism, and she was also formed by having spent parts of her youth in this deeply Jewish bohemian arts world in New York, where she's studying with Stella Adler, one of the major figures of Yiddish theater, and she's studying painting with Norman Rabin, who's the child of Shalom Aleichem. And she gave all that to me. And at the same time, we didn't grow up connected to a community. And so we had the texts and the ideas and the spirituality and the artistic tradition. And we were living in a part of the world where there weren't many Jews, but there were the Hasidim, there was Kiryas Yoel down the road. So then when I left home, I was just completely fascinated by other Jews because it was the first time in my life I was really meeting other Jews. And I think the fact that I didn't grow up deeply attached to one particular form or strand of Judaism, it gave me a great freedom to appreciate and take in the wisdom of all strands of Judaism. And I think sometimes, people feel, well, I grew up this way, and so this should be done this way. And if someone else doesn't do it this way, they're missing the point. But for me, there was no point to miss because I had no default, right? So as I went into the world, I got very close to a Chabad rabbi, and I became friends with all sorts of people who'd grown up Reform or conservative and Mizrahi and Ashkenazi and people from all different Jewish backgrounds. And I'm always interested in how other Jews understand each other. And to me, the Hasidim are so fascinating because, you go to these original texts, right? Read Buber's Tales of the Hasidim, or just read, material around the Baal Shem Tov. It's tremendous philosophically. It's so interesting. So there's a lot of that here in the book. There's what I would almost call a neo-Hasidic cultural dimension. But also, I'm someone who, because I was growing up far away from Jewish community in a conventional sense, I loved the way that Jewish literature connected me to other Jews before there were many Jews in my life. So reading Chaim Potok or Henry Roth, these were transformative experiences for me as a teenager. And there's a scene that you describe where this Chabad rabbi comes into my mother's hospital room at the end and, is trying to offer, conventional services. And I say to him, sort of, with all due respect to your form of Judaism, this isn't what she's asking for. Just try to understand that her Jewish identity is as rich as yours.
I'll say in the scene, it's with not that much due respect, but the point still stands. Yeah.
Okay, well, he should have knocked. He should have knocked. He barged into the hospital room. But to me, this is sort of the most compelling aspect of Judaism. It's such a rich tradition that you can have two Jews in the same room who are completely defined by their Judaism in a truthful, earnest way. And they can share almost nothing in common with the other person's Judaism. But that's how rich our tradition is, that it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I'm trying to offer my own interpretation, my own identity, which is one that is rooted in a spiritual and artistic tradition. And I thought a great deal, this is the last thing I'll say, as I was writing, I thought a great deal about the other Jewish writers who had written mother-son love stories. I thought about Amos Oz, The Tale of Love and Darkness, to me, the great mother-son love story. I thought about Henry Roth, Call It Sleep. Those were very important novels to me.
I'll just say an incredible anecdote from when Sam was finishing up his manuscript. He called me. He said it's an emergency, which is not something you don't often hear manuscript-related emergencies. And he said, I just gave my book to Tony Kushner, who's a big fan, who read it, who loved it. And but Tony Kushner had one note. And he said the one note is that I had a midrash in there. And Sam, so what was the original midrash? That God used spit to create Adam?
Yeah, that's right.
And Tony Kushner somehow has the midrashic knowledge and said that midrash doesn't exist. And so Sam was on the hunt to figure out if it did in fact exist. And then you have an incredible origin story for where you actually got that from. But it's very funny. And so I saw in the final galley, in the final manuscript, you did do a slight shift, even though I totally encourage you to keep it in as a fake midrash and see who else knows midrash as well as Tony Kushner. But yeah, I was very sort of pleased to see that whole story really gives me a lot of joy.
Oh, by the way, he had 12 notes. That was one of them.
That's the only one you called me about. Yeah.
But that is very fascinating because, well, let's talk about it, because what I'm describing there is someone has said that I look like Dylan's spitting image. And I'm thinking about the metaphor, and I say it doesn't, as language, it doesn't work. Parents don't spit out children. And then I think and I say the only thing close would be God spitting out the clay into which he made Adam. And I had heard a revered and nameless, I won't name him, a revered Jewish scholar describe this once. But Tony was right that there's no midrash. There's no interpretation in which he spits. Hashem, there's no spitting. He breathes. All right. And I did a great deal of research to understand where did this come from. And it's actually a first century AD Christian interpretation. And to me, that is all the difference in the world. Are we created by Hashem spitting us out or by breathing life into us? And I think that also goes to some of the questions in the novel. How are we created? How do we interpret our own origins? Were we made with love, with care, or with indifference? Right? And we get to choose which story we tell of our lives. My mother used to say there are two stories to every life. You can tell your life through a narrative of love, redemption, or bitterness, resentment. How do you choose to interpret your own life? And it's all there in that midrash that doesn't exist.
We have some Q&As from the audience, but I have a question before we get there. I have one last question. And it's one that I was really, again, because I know you, but it's a question I've never had before. I've never been in this position. And it's a tiny bit personal. You can tell me to, buzz off if it does overstep. But I was just so struck by the last few chapters where you describe your mother's death. And I just want to ask, like, it's a little broad, but what was that like? Sort of reliving that memory and writing about her death. And was it what you sort of expected in that process? Was it did you? Yeah, I'm sort of even at a loss of words for how to ask the question, but I'm keen to know.
Yeah. I think sometimes we really struggle to talk about the most painful, informative things in life. Watching someone you love dearly die is it's a transformative experience. It makes you a different person. But it's hard to think of any contemporary novel that goes to that place, that's willing to take us as the reader to that place. And after my mother died, I knew this was the most raw and profound experience that I've ever lived through as a person. And I want to take the reader with me and show what it was like. And I'm not going to shy away from the fact that it was painful, agonizing to experience, agonizing to recreate. And yet, I knew that my task as her son and as an artist was to write about the end of her life in a way in which the love would be larger than the loss, and in which it would be bearable for the reader, because you would feel the depth of love between these two people, and you would feel that the great resource that we have to confront death is love. And that is what grief is, right? Without love, there is no grief, right? Right. Um, so that's look, it was very difficult to write. I only started writing it 3 years after she died. I mean, after I left that hospital, I never wanted to return to it in my mind. And then at the time when I was finally emotionally ready to leave the hospital, that's when I knew I had to go back. I had to go back as a writer, and I had to bring the reader with me. And I had to show that it was something that actually we are able to face. We are able to confront that.
As a closing comment from me until we open up to the crowd, I just want to note that I don't think I've ever I have not read a novel in a long time, it's particularly a debut novel that is so sort of confronts these questions so earnestly, and again with this kind of like emotional audacity, and it's just like there's no you're not crouching it in irony, and you're not like the vulnerability is just really fronted, and so hats off. Like really kudos for writing a book like that.
Thank you,
Uh,
Menachem. That means a lot to me. Can I say something about that? That
okay, yeah,
actually
this is
I
you're the
think,
man.
again, so much of this book is about coming to understand myself and the experiences that shaped me. And when I was young, I used to resent that I was, from this tiny town Goshen in the middle of nowhere. And I thought that was what would hold me back as an artist. And what I've come to see is actually, in a way, one of the gifts that I was given was my own provincial naivete. I thought that I thought that art was supposed to be earnest. I didn't encounter cultural irony really until I went to college. I thought the purpose of a work of art was that it should help us more deeply understand ourselves and the people around us. And I didn't know that was uncool. Um, and, and, and then when I realized that some people thought that was uncool, I kind of decided, all right, well, that's not my audience. And I think art is there to confront the really significant, meaningful, true things in our lives.
Okay, that's a really nice sentiment for us to wrap up this part of the conversation. And so I want to sort of tackle, um, in a way, I want to tackle some of these questions. And so because they're all hitting on a subject, most of them are hitting on a subject which I personally, like, I'm not that curious about, but I am sort of curious in the larger topic. So people are asking, don't answer this question yet. Everyone's based the everyone, not everyone, but like more than half of the questions are asking why you haven't or do you want to just get a DNA test to put this mystery to rest? Pause on that. I'm interested in actually taking a step back. And so you have this sort of very unusual, very extraordinary life circumstances. You've written a book in part, although I think, as you said, it's kind of a Trojan horse for the real story. But you've written a book about those extraordinary and unusual circumstances, which, as you totally expected, would get a lot of attention. As in, sort of like the hook for a lot of people about you, about the book, is this connection with Bob Dylan. And so I'm interested in you personally right now that the book's out in the world, it's getting a lot of love, it's getting a lot of attention, people are really obsessed with Bob Dylan, how you are sort of choosing to navigate that.
Oh, what would that test tell me about myself that I don't know?
Forget the test for a
What?
second.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
forget the
Well,
test.
no, no.
Yeah.
If people are asking, I think it's important
All right.
question. I think um, the book that I've written, the life that I've lived, the moral and spiritual center of that is the journey from thinking that I could best understand myself through him to understanding that the essence of who I am, what I value in the person that I'm trying to become, what I cherish in myself, all of that came from my mother. So that's who I am. And that's the way that I choose to understand my own life. So I don't, there's nothing there for me. I have everything I need. I'm complete.
And then, oh, so that's, yeah, that I sort of, this is the answer sort of I intuited from speaking with you over the years. And, people are definitely curious about it. And so, but I'm interested like one level up, sort of like this like intense fascination coming at you that goes beyond the book. There's plenty of people out there who are be like, oh, there's a book about this. I don't, man, I'm not a big reader, but I'm like, oh, I'm obsessed with Dylan. I'm just everything Dylan's children, acknowledged children, unacknowledged children. And there's a focus coming at you that's a sort of extra literary. And is this something, do you have to navigate this? Is this interesting? Is it annoying? Do you feel like, yeah, I'm sort of, where's your head at?
Well, I guess what's interesting to me about that is that I think it's focused on the wrong part of the story, in the sense that what I've written is, I mean, based on my mother's account, is the most intimate portrait of Dylan writing Blood on the Tracks that, to my knowledge, has ever been published. And so for people who want to understand more about him as an artist, what I've written is also unique because it's the portrait of him through his lover's eyes and as he's writing this album, right? And so people who want to understand more about him as an artist can read that. And many, many Dylan admirers have reached out to me and said, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for describing it. And I think in that sense, if you want to understand him, look at him. Don't look at me. I mean, do you understand? Yeah, I mean, like, you know what I mean? I mean, it's sort of a fixation with the wrong dimension. His story is about him, and my story is about me. And I mean, if let's just be honest here. I mean, he's someone who allegedly has many, many unrecognized offspring. Does that change how you understand him as an artist, how you listen to his songs, his music? I mean, I, I don't think it gives you a deeper understanding. So, they're different stories. And I hope I've given justice to, the account of him writing this album and my mother's descriptions of it. But I don't think you can understand Dylan more deeply as an artist by sort of fixating on me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I can't relate to the Dylan obsessed. I mean, I guess I can, like celebrity, but I don't understand it. I'm not in the Dylan world. And so like I don't know much. It doesn't sort of provoke this sort of rabid curiosity that it does seem with other people who are completists. Even like the artists I'm more familiar with, their personal life is sort of of glancing interest. But Dylan seems to be one of the few sort of like real, quote unquote, like real artists whose personal life is just like an object of microscopic obsession.
Yeah, well, that's because we don't have royals in this country, right? So we need someone to obsess over. But, that's trivia. That's not really art. I mean, I never understand when the Dylanologists are obsessed with all these facts about his life. What color shoes was he wearing on this day? And I mean, some of these people are kind of nuts, and I know because more than one of them has tried to get into my apartment. And but to me, like the great irony there is they're kind of missing what I think is interesting about him as an artist. He's someone who's sort of, spinning his own myth. He's not someone who cares about facticity, right? I mean, he's a storyteller. So what's interesting about him is in his work, right? He famously doesn't talk very much about his own music because he understands that the art itself is the most interesting thing. So I guess maybe that's just how I feel about any artist you admire, is that Don DeLillo, a novelist I admire enormously, he has a great line where he says the novelist is the human detritus that floats in the wake of the novel, right? I mean, um, what's most compelling about a work of art is that work of art. And then we feel that we want to possess it, we want to own it. So if we know what color shoes the artist is wearing, we own it. But art is more mythical than that. I mean, I think Judaism understands that, right? Judaism understands that what makes us who we are the stories that we tell, that we pass on, right? You can, I mean, I sit every year and hold a Pesach um, dinner and tell the story of Exodus. I actually have written my own Haggadah called the Yorkville Haggadah. And do I do that because I think that it's a factual rendering? I mean, some people believe that, and I respect that. It's not my belief. That doesn't detract from the meaning of the story of Exodus, the great stories ever told, right?
I think that's a wonderful place to end. And so I want to, again, I don't think Thea, are you popping back on? Wink once, if yes. So, but otherwise, I just want to thank again everyone who sponsored the event. Again, Sam, thank you so much for giving me the privilege to interrogate that big, beautiful brain. I'm so happy and proud that you're having this incredible success with the book. And yeah, and so thank everyone for coming out. And I just want to do one last pitch. The book is available now. There is a link in the chat. Please order. And for those who are asking about the recording, it will be sent out tomorrow. I think Sam is gonna, yep, he has a spiel.
No spiel. I'm just going to say, for those who are interested, there are a lot of in-person events, including another that Thea is wonderfully organizing on October 27th with Jonathan Safran Foer. And so you can find all this information. I have a number of events in New York, across the country, something like 45 events in the US and the UK. So you can find this all at samevansussman.org. And I love meeting readers. I love talking to people about art and literature. So come out to an event, come say hello. And there are lots and lots of events across the country.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.